My name is Nadine Calloway and I am 52 years old. I have been called a disappointment by my mother for so long that by the time she said it at my daughter's graduation dinner in front of 23 people, I had almost stopped hearing it. Almost. Sophie had just walked across that stage 3 hours earlier. Sophie, who was 28 years old and had worked 6 years and passed the bar on her first attempt and was sitting at the head of the dinner table in the restaurant we had reserved 3 months in advance, still wearing the small gold earrings she had borrowed from me the morning of the ceremony because she said they were lucky. And my mother, Margaret, looked down the length of that table, past the flowers and the champagne and the 23 people who had come to celebrate my daughter, and she said what she had been saying in different forms my entire life. That Sophie's accomplishment was remarkable, that it must come from somewhere, that talent like that, drive like that, couldn't have come from Nadine's side of the family. She said it with a smile. She always said it with a smile. What my mother did not know, or what none of them knew, then was that my granddaughter Maisie was sitting 3 seats down at that table. She was 9 years old. She had her mother's braids and her grandfather's eyes and a purple backpack under her chair that she had been carrying for 3 weeks. Her great-grandfather Frank had given her something to keep safe before he died in January. He had told her to give it to her grandma Nadine at the right time. He had said Maisie would know when. Maisie decided my mother's smile was the right time. She reached under her chair and pulled out her purple backpack and she set it on the table and she looked at me with 9-year-old certainty and she said, quiet enough that only I could hear her, "Grandma, I think now. Before I tell you what she took out of that backpack, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and your time in the comments. I love knowing where you are when you hear these stories." Now let me take you back because what happened at that dinner table did not begin with a dinner. It began the summer I was 7 years old and my sister Lauren won the spelling bee and my mother put the ribbon on the refrigerator and I stood in the kitchen doorway and understood, in the wordless way children understand things, exactly how the math of this family was going to work. There are families where love is distributed carefully, in proportion to merit, according to a set of standards nobody ever explicitly states but everyone understands completely. My family was one of those families. The standards were clear even if they were never spoken out loud. Be organized. Be successful. Be the version of yourself that requires the least explanation when your mother is talking about you to other people. Lauren was 7 years older than me and had been practicing these standards since before I was born. By the time I arrived, she had the shape of them memorized. She was precise where I was scattered. She was focused where I was curious about too many things at once. She stayed in Columbus where we grew up, took over the family insurance business, married a man named Richard who wore his competence the same way Lauren wore hers, on the outside where everyone could see it. I went to art school in Pittsburgh. This was my first significant crime, not literally. My parents paid for it, somewhat begrudgingly, because my father, Frank, believed in education in the general sense, even when the specific form made my mother nervous. But, in the family mythology, art school was the first data point in a pattern my mother had been constructing about me for as long as I could remember. Nadine is creative, said with just enough warmth to feel like a compliment and just enough distance to feel like something else. Nadine does things her own way, said in a tone that suggested her own way was a direction on the map nobody else had bothered to use because it didn't go anywhere interesting. I married Derek in my late 20s. Derek Calloway, who was a high school history teacher and who had been teaching the same AP American history class for 22 years with a success rate that would make some college professors jealous and who showed up to every school event and coached the debate team and had the most elaborately organized lesson plan binder I had ever seen. He was not a rich man. He was not a man who wore his ambition on the outside. He was steady and specific and funny in the way of people who have read enough history to know that most human drama is really the same story wearing different clothes. My mother liked Derek fine. She said this often. Liked him fine. In the vocabulary of Margaret Paulson, liked him fine was the grade you received when you had answered the question correctly, but with handwriting that was difficult to read. She liked Richard exquisitely. She said this differently, with her whole posture, with the way she filled his coffee cup before he had finished the first, with the particular pride of a woman whose son-in-law confirmed her sense of what success was supposed to look like. We gave my mother grandchildren, Marcus first, then Sophie. Marcus became an electrician with his own small company, which my mother described to her bridge club as Marcus Works in Contracting. Sophie went to Ohio State, then to law school at Case Western, then passed the bar and joined a firm in Cleveland that handled environmental law. which she cared about with the specific passion of someone who had chosen work she believed in rather than work that was convenient. My mother described Sophie to the bridge club as Lauren's niece went to law school, not my granddaughter. Lauren's niece. I want to be clear that I noticed this. I also want to be clear that I had been noticing things like this for 45 years and had developed out of necessity a particular discipline around it. You can notice something and not be destroyed by it. You can see clearly and still choose the next thing with your own two hands. I had built a life I loved, a marriage that felt like home, children who knew they were wanted, a small graphic design business I had been running for 18 years that paid our mortgage and funded Sophie's undergraduate tuition and allowed me to spend every day doing work that required me to think about beauty and function simultaneously, which is the combination that makes me feel most myself. My mother knew about the business. She described it as Nadine does some freelance work. These are the small deaths of a family dynamic that functions on comparison. They don't kill you all at once. They happen in increments over decades, at holiday tables and birthday dinners and casual phone calls where someone says something that is technically not cruel enough to object to, and you let it pass because you have learned that objecting is more expensive than absorbing. I absorbed for 45 years. I am telling you this so you understand that what happened at Sophie's graduation dinner was not an isolated incident. It was the latest entry in a very long record. My father Frank died in January. He was 81 years old, and he died the way certain people die. Quietly over the course of weeks, giving the people who loved him enough time to come and sit beside him, but not enough time to fully believe it was happening. I drove to Columbus 3 times in the last month of his life. I sat beside his bed and held his hand, and we talked, sometimes for hours, about the things you talk about when time has clarified what was always important. He asked about Derek, about Marcus, about Sophie. He asked about a book I had recommended to him 6 months earlier and whether I thought the ending was earned. He laughed at a story I told him about a design client who had wanted everything in the color she described as salmon, but kept approving shades I would have called orange. He was funny until the end. That was one of his gifts. 2 weeks before he died, when it was just the two of us in the afternoon and the winter light was coming in gray through the hospital window, he said something I had been turning over ever since. I've been watching a long time, Nadine. His voice was thin by then, but his eyes were clear. I didn't always say the right things when I should have. Dad, let me say it. He squeezed my hand. Not hard. He didn't have hard left, but deliberately. You built something real, the way you built it, quietly, on your own terms, without needing anyone to tell you it was good enough. That's harder than it looks. I should have said that out loud when you could have used hearing it. I pressed my lips together. I was not going to cry. I was going to let him finish. I made some arrangements, he said, before I couldn't anymore. There are things that should have been handled differently a long time ago, and I handled them differently now instead. He looked at the window. Late is better than never, I think. What arrangements? He turned back to me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Something between resolution and apology. I've left instructions. You'll find out when it's time. A pause. I need to ask you something, and I need you to say yes. He asked about Maisie, about whether I thought Maisie could be trusted with something important. I told him that Maisie had been the most reliably trustworthy person I knew since she was approximately 6 years old, and that she took the responsibilities people gave her more seriously than most adults I knew. He smiled. I know. I've been watching her. He made me call Maisie into the room. What happened in that room between my father and my 9-year-old granddaughter, I know only from what Maisie told me later, in pieces, in the way children tell you things, not all at once, not in order, but eventually completely. He had given her something in a sealed envelope. He had told her it was important and that she was the only person he trusted to keep it safe and deliver it to Grandma Nadine at the right moment. He had told her she would know the right moment when she saw it. He had described it with the careful specificity of a man who understood children better than most adults gave him credit for, as the moment when someone says something unfair about Grandma Nadine and everyone goes quiet. Maisie had looked at him with 9-year-old solemnity and said, "Like at Christmas dinner." He had laughed, which Maisie told me was a very good sound to hear from him right then. He died 11 days later. Maisie put the sealed envelope in the front pocket of her purple backpack and carried it to school every day for 3 weeks. and then to Sophie's graduation dinner, where she sat 3 seats from me with her mother's braids and her grandfather's eyes and waited. I did not know what was in the envelope. I want to be clear about that. My father had told me he had made arrangements. He had not told me the nature of them, and in the weeks after his death, with the grief and the logistics and the estate processes moving through our lives in the blunt procedural way of those things, I had set that conversation aside in the way you set aside something you don't yet have the bandwidth to open. There was a will. It had been prepared years earlier by the family attorney. A was in it, as was Lauren. The division was proportional and unsurprising given the family dynamics. Lauren received the family home, which she had been managing as the local child for years, and I received a cash sum that was respectable and fair, and significantly smaller than what Lauren received because the family home was valued at something considerable. I did not contest this. It was not unexpected. What I did not know was that 6 weeks before he died, my father had visited a different attorney, one he had selected himself, without telling my mother, without consulting the family attorney of record. He had made an appointment, driven himself there on a Tuesday morning while my mother was at her garden club, and executed a document. I did not know this until Maisie put her hand in her purple backpack, but I want to tell you about the time between my father's death and Sophie's graduation dinner, because that time has its own shape and it matters. My mother called me 3 times in the weeks after the funeral. Each call had the particular texture of calls from my mother, warm on the surface, precise underneath, moving towards something she had already decided before she picked up the phone. The first call was about logistics. The second was about a piece of furniture she wanted to give to Lauren. The third was about Sophie's graduation dinner. She wanted to host it. She explained, already spoken to Lauren about the restaurant, had spoken to Richard about the reservation, had put together a guest list. "Mom," I said, "Sophie's dinner, her graduation." "Of course," she said, easily. "I just wanted to make sure it was done properly." Done properly, in the vocabulary of Margaret Paulson, properly meant her way, by her plan, according to her sense of what the occasion required. I recognized it. I had been recognizing it for 45 years. I told her I would call the restaurant myself. She said that was fine, as long as the table was large enough, as long as the right people were invited, as long as the evening reflected how proud the whole family was. "Of Sophie," I said. "Of course, of Sophie," she said. "What else would I mean?" I called the restaurant. I made the reservation. I sent the invitations. I planned the dinner the way I had always done things, quietly, on my own terms, without needing anyone to tell me it was being done correctly. Maisie carried her purple backpack for 3 more weeks without telling me what was in it. She'd given her word to her great-grandfather, and she was keeping it. That is the kind of person Maisie is. It is one of the things I love most about her. On the morning of Sophie's graduation, I found Maisie in the kitchen at 7 a.m., already dressed, backpack on her shoulders, eating cereal with the focused seriousness of someone who had places to be. "Why do you have your backpack?" I asked. She looked at me over her cereal. "I'm keeping it close," she said. I did not push further. I had learned with Maisie that pushing further was rarely necessary if you were patient. Sophie walked across the stage at 11 in the morning in a ceremony that lasted 2 hours and felt like 2 minutes. She was somewhere in the middle of the processional line, and when her name was called, I grabbed Derek's arm without meaning to, and he put his hand over mine, and we watched our daughter walk across that stage and accept that folder and turn to the crowd with a smile I had been watching grow for 28 years. I thought about all the evenings of her undergraduate thesis, spread across our kitchen table. I thought about the LSAT prep books she had carried in her own backpack for 6 months. I thought about the phone call she had made from law school after her first set of finals, voice thin and exhausted, asking whether she was actually cut out for this, and what I had said, which was, "Sophie, you're cut out for things that haven't been invented yet. Don't confuse hard with impossible. She graduated with honors." I cried. Derek cried. Marcus lifted his daughter Maisie onto his shoulders so she could see over the crowd, and Maisie waved her program in the air and shouted, "Aunt Sophie," with the full force of 9-year-old lungs. My mother, standing to my left, applauded precisely, clapping for exactly the appropriate duration, smiling with the particular smile of a woman who will claim this accomplishment for the family narrative regardless of what role she played in it. We drove to the restaurant separately. Derek and I arrived first. The private room was set with 23 place settings, white tablecloths, a small flower arrangement at each end, Sophie's name on a card at the head of the table. I had requested this specifically. Maisie arrived with Marcus and his wife Janelle. She took her seat without removing her backpack, slinging it under her chair where it sat like a small purple companion through the appetizers and the champagne toast and the first course. Lauren and Richard were 2 seats to my mother's right. They had come from Columbus that morning, and Lauren was wearing the kind of dress she always wore to things, a dress that communicated that she had thought about what to wear while also communicating that she had not tried too hard, which is its own significant effort. She congratulated Sophie warmly. She meant it, I think. Lauren was not a woman without love for her niece. Her failings were not cruelty, they were a narrowness, a tendency to see the world through the vocabulary of her own success and to struggle to recognize different currencies as valid.
The dinner was warm in the way good dinners are when people who love the same person come together with their various complications set temporarily aside. There were stories about Sophie's childhood, her determination at 6, the debate she had with her 3rd-grade teacher about a grading policy that she had articulated with extraordinary precision was fundamentally unfair. There was laughter. There was a second bottle of champagne that Derek opened with more force than intended, and which produced a sound that startled the table and then produced more laughter. I was happy in this specific way of a mother at her daughter's graduation dinner, complete and a little undone by it. Sophie across the table kept catching my eye and smiling in the shorthand of a relationship that has its own language developed over 28 years. We were between the main course and the dessert when my mother stood up. She did not announce that she was going to speak. She simply stood, the way she always moved through a room, as though the room had been arranged in anticipation of her. She raised her champagne glass. "I want to say something," she said, "about what today means." The table quieted. 23 people arranged their attention. "Sophie, what you have accomplished is extraordinary." Her voice was warm. It was genuinely warm. My mother loved Sophie. Whatever I am about to tell you, please hold that alongside it. You are an incredible woman, and today is proof of what this family is capable of when someone applies themselves completely. Murmurs of agreement around the table. I think about where that comes from. My mother continued. She was in full flight now, the particular flight of a woman who has prepared remarks and is enjoying delivering them. Your grandfather's determination, Lauren's work ethic. You've always admired your Aunt Lauren, Sophie, and it shows. She smiled down the table at Lauren. That drive, that discipline, that refusal to accept anything less than excellence. That's the pulse inside. That's what made this possible. Sophie, at the head of the table, had a careful expression. She had heard versions of this her entire life. She knew how to hold it. "I look at you," my mother said, "and I see everything our family hoped for." She looked at me then. She looked at me with the smile that was a measurement. "It's funny," she said, not unkindly. This was important. She never said these things unkindly. How children can surpass their parents so completely, how the talent can skip a generation or find a different path. A small pause, perfectly timed. Nadine has always done things her own way, and I suppose that's what led to Sophie finding her own way forward. She raised her glass higher. To Sophie, who shows us that potential finds its level. The table raised their glasses. Most people were looking at Sophie. I was looking at my mother. Derek beside me had gone very still. He had the controlled stillness of a man who had 22 years of history teaching behind him and had learned what it looked like when something significant was about to happen. Across the table, Lauren was looking at her champagne. She had heard this version of events before. She had, for most of our lives, benefited from it. Whether she was comfortable with it at this specific moment, I could not say. Sophie was not raising her glass. She was looking at me with an expression I recognized. The one she had made since she was a child when someone did something she considered specifically unjust and was calculating whether to say something. I gave her the smallest shake of my head. Not yet. I did not speak. I did not need to speak. 3 seats down, Maisie reached under her chair. Before I tell you what Maisie took out of that backpack, I want to stop for one moment. Because if you are listening to this and you have a person in your life who has been doing this to you, not with cruelty, not with malice, but with the steady accumulated weight of small comments that rewrite your value every time they are delivered, I want you to hear something. You do not have to be loud to hold your ground. You do not have to argue the point. You do not have to spend the next 20 years making the case for yourself to someone who has already decided the verdict. You just have to know what is true. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, the truth has been waiting in a purple backpack at a graduation dinner for exactly the right moment. Tell me in the comments if you have someone like my mother in your life. Tell me where you're watching from.
I want to know who needs to hear this tonight. And please subscribe if you haven't yet, because Maisie has just reached under her chair. Maisie Calloway has been, since approximately the age of 4, the kind of child who completes tasks. Not because she was told to, because she had decided they were important, and once Maisie decided something was important, it was going to get done. She reached under her chair and pulled up her purple backpack and set it on the table in front of her with the deliberate care of someone handling something they've been entrusted with. She unzipped the front pocket. She reached in. She took out a sealed envelope, cream-colored, with my name on the front in my father's handwriting. Nadine. Just my name. In blue ink. His particular looping capital N. The table had not noticed yet. The toast was still settling. Conversations were resuming around the glasses being set back down. But I had noticed. I stared at the envelope. Maisie held it across the 2 empty seats between us, arm extended, looking at me with the gravity of someone completing a mission she had been preparing for since January. "Grandpa gave it to me," she said, in her normal voice, not a whisper. "He said to give it to you when the time was right." She glanced briefly at my mother, who had sat back down and was accepting congratulations from the person to her left. I think the time was right. The table had gone quiet again, not all of it, but the far end was still talking. But the center of it, the people nearest to Maisie, had seen the envelope and gone quiet. Derek reached over and took my hand. I took the envelope from Maisie. My mother had turned back to the table. She saw the envelope. She saw my father's handwriting. Something moved across her face. Not quite recognition, not quite alarm, something between the two that was its own expression. "What is that?" she said. "It's from Dad," I said. A pause. "Where did—" "Grandpa Frank gave it to me," Maisie said with the clear factual confidence of a 9-year-old who has been waiting 3 weeks to say exactly this. "He said it was for Grandma Nadine, and I was the one who was supposed to bring it." My mother looked at Maisie, then at the envelope in my hand. Something in her expression shifted. She had the look of a woman recalibrating, a woman who had expected a room she had arranged and was now standing in a different one. Sophie had sat forward at the head of the table. Lauren was watching. Richard was watching. 23 people at a graduation dinner had arranged their attention toward the woman with the cream-colored envelope with her name in her dead father's handwriting. I broke the seal. There were 2 things inside. The first was a letter, 3 pages, handwritten on his yellow legal pad paper. I knew the paper. He had been writing on yellow legal pads since before I could remember. Every grocery list, every note, every important thing he had ever needed to write down had happened on those yellow pages. The second was a document, folded, official, several pages, with a cover letter from an attorney named James Whitfield at a firm I did not recognize. I read the letter first. At the table, in front of 23 people, some things do not wait for a private moment. I am going to tell you what it said because it deserves to be said completely. He began with my name, not Dear Nadine, just Nadine, the way he had always gotten my attention when something mattered. He wrote that he had been watching for a long time. He wrote that watching without acting had been the error of his life he regretted most specifically, not the largest error perhaps, but the one that had cost something he cared about. He had watched me be measured against a standard I had never chosen and found wanting according to a scale that had nothing to do with what he actually valued. He had let it happen at dinner tables and holiday gatherings and quiet phone calls, and he had said not enough because saying enough would have required a kind of confrontation he had spent his whole life avoiding. He wrote that this was not a virtue. He wrote that he was sorry. He wrote about the things he had watched me build. The business, which he had followed more carefully than I knew. He had kept every piece of paper I had ever given him with my designs on it, and there was a folder in his desk drawer in Columbus that I would find. He wrote about Derek and the specific way Derek loved his family, which Frank said he had recognized as the real thing from the first year and had never stopped being grateful for. He wrote about Marcus and Sophie, about the particular ways they were themselves, and about his certainty that the people they had become were not accidents of genetics, but the result of being raised by a woman who knew what she was doing even when nobody said so. He wrote about Maisie. He wrote that of all the gifts his family had given him in his 81 years, watching Maisie Calloway exist in the world had been one of the clearest pleasures. He wrote that he had chosen her for this errand not because the others weren't trustworthy, but because Maisie understood the weight of a promise in a way that some people spent their whole lives never learning. Then he wrote about the document. He had visited a different attorney in November. He had sat down with James Whitfield at Whitfield and Associates, and he had executed a codicil. an amendment to his existing will. He had done this without telling my mother, without telling the family attorney, without telling Lauren or me or anyone. The codicil made a specific transfer. The family home, which had been intended for Lauren in the original will, would still go to Lauren. He was not changing that. But the family investment portfolio, 3 decades of savings and growth that my father had managed quietly and carefully and which neither Lauren nor I had known the full extent of, had been reallocated to me, entirely to me. He wrote the number. I read the number twice. I will not say the exact number because it is private, but I will tell you it was large enough that my hand went still on the paper and I had to breathe deliberately for several seconds before I continued reading. He wrote that this was not a punishment for Lauren. He wanted me to understand that Lauren had received the home, which was what Lauren had always wanted and was the right outcome, but the financial portfolio had never been earmarked. And when he thought about where it should go, i.e., when he sat in his hospital bed in January and thought about what he actually believed about the people he was leaving, he came to an answer that did not require a great deal of deliberation. He wrote, "The world told you your whole life that you were the lesser version. I am telling you now, with everything I have left to say, that the world was wrong. You are the version of this family that kept its word, raised its children, built something real with its own hands, and did not require anyone's approval to know that it was good. That is rarer than law degrees and inheritance plans. That is what I should have said at every table where I sat and said nothing." He wrote, "I love you, Nadine. I always have. I was just not loud enough about it, and that is my failure, not yours." He signed it Frank. Not Dad, Frank. His full name, the way he signed official things. Because this was an official thing. I looked up from the letter. The table was completely silent. 23 people. I could hear the ambient sound of the restaurant outside the private room. I could hear Maisie breathing beside me, watching me with her grandfather's eyes. My mother was looking at the letter in my hand. Her face had a quality I had never seen on it in 52 years. It was not anger. It was not the managed warmth of a woman in control of a room. It was something underneath all of that, stripped of its covering, exposed to the specific light of a dinner table on a May evening. It was the expression of a woman who understood that the person she had been certain about her whole life had been watching her with the same clarity she had always believed was hers alone. I placed the document on the table, the codicil from James Whitfield. I did not need to explain it. The letterhead was visible. My father's signature was visible on the last page. Sophie, at the head of the table, had tears running down her face. She was not making a sound. She was sitting perfectly straight in her graduation clothes, and she was crying the way I recognized from her childhood. Full and complete and without apology. Derek's hand was still over mine. Lauren was looking at the document. Her expression was complicated in the way of a woman who has spent a lifetime in a position she believed was earned and is confronting the possibility that it was assigned. I did not look at her for long. That was not what this moment was about. I looked at my mother. Margaret Paulson was 77 years old. She was a woman of formidable organization and lifelong certainty, and I had always known underneath everything real love for her family in the particular constrained form that was the only shape she knew how to give it. She was not a villain. She was a woman who had chosen a story about her family and had told it so many times it had become indistinguishable from truth, and was sitting at a graduation dinner confronting the fact that the person she had left out of that story had been the subject of her husband's most deliberate final act. She looked at the letter in my hand. She looked at Maisie, who was sitting 3 seats away with her purple backpack in her lap, watching her great-grandmother with the unsentimental clarity of a 9-year-old who has completed her mission and is now observing the consequences. My mother opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at the table. Lauren reached over and placed her hand on my mother's arm, not to speak, just to be there. Whatever Lauren was processing in that moment, she understood that her mother needed an anchor, and she was the one in reach. I looked at my daughter at the head of the table, Sophie, who was 28 years old and had worked 6 years for the folder she had walked across, a stage to accept that morning, who had her grandmother's stubbornness and her grandfather's patience and something else, something specifically her own, that I had been watching with wonder since she was 3 months old and had regarded me from my arms, with the expression of someone taking everything in and making notes. "Mom," Sophie said. Her voice was steady despite the tears. "Can I say something?" "Of course," I said. Sophie looked at her grandmother, not with anger, with the careful directness of a person who has been trained in argument and has chosen, at this specific moment, to deploy it with love rather than damage. "Grandma," she said, "I love you. I want you to know that completely before I say the rest." She paused. "The reason I got here is not the Paulson work ethic. It's not Aunt Lauren's drive. It's my mother taking a phone call from me at 11:30 on a Wednesday night when I had failed my first practice exam and telling me that hard and impossible are not the same thing." Her voice was entirely level. "It's my dad showing up to every single event of my childhood because showing up was the thing he understood as fundamental. It's the way my parents built a house that felt like a house because they paid attention to what that required." She looked at me. "You did not slip a generation, Mom. You raised me. That's where I come from." The room was quiet. Maisie beside me nodded once, as though this confirmed something she had already known. My mother did not speak for the remainder of the dinner. She was not silent in the way of a woman who had nothing to say. She was silent in the way of a woman processing something too large for the current container. I recognized the difference. I had known her for 52 years. We did not have a confrontation. There was no explosion, no scene. The dinner concluded with dessert and coffee and the particular quiet that settles over a table after something significant has moved through it. People gathered themselves. Goodbyes were said. Sophie was embraced by each person there, and each embrace was genuine, and she received them with the grace of a woman who had worked 6 years for this and was not going to let the complicated parts of the evening steal the uncomplicated parts. Lauren found me in the hallway outside the private room as people were getting their coats. She stood in front of me with the expression of a woman who has prepared something to say and is deciding, at the last moment, whether it is the right thing. "I didn't know about the portfolio," she said. "I know. I didn't." She stopped. Started again. "I never said those things about you, Nadine, not the way she did." "No," I said. "But you let them be said." It was not an accusation. It was just true, and saying it quietly was something I had needed to do for 20 years, and the quiet of that hallway after the letter and the document and Maisie's purple backpack was the first moment I had the ground under me to say it. Lauren absorbed this. She was a woman accustomed to being precise, and she recognized precision in others when she encountered it. "I know," she said finally. "I know I did." We stood in the hallway for a moment. "I'm going to need you to be different going forward," I said. "Not as a punishment. Just as a condition." She nodded. "Okay," she said. "That was the beginning of something, not a resolution. Lauren and I are still building the new version of our relationship from different materials than the old one was built from, and building is slow work up more, but a beginning. The kind that starts when someone says, 'I know,' and means it." My mother called me the following week. She called on a Tuesday morning, which was unusual. She called Sundays as a rule, the organizational call, the touching of bases. Tuesday was outside the protocol, and outside the protocol meant something had shifted. Her voice was different. Not entirely. My mother's voice carries the weight of 77 years of certainty, and that does not evaporate in a week. But something in the underlayer had changed. The architecture was the same. The furniture slightly rearranged. She said she had been thinking about the letter. She said she had not known the full extent of the portfolio. She said she had not always been fair. She did not say, "I'm sorry." My mother does not have a ready relationship with that phrase. What she said instead was, "I have not always seen you clearly. I think your father saw you better than I did, and I think I should have paid more attention to what he saw." For my mother, that was a significant sentence. I did not rush to reassure her. I let it stand without decoration. "I think that too," I said. We talked for 40 minutes. About my father, about the designs in the folder in his desk drawer, about Maisie. When I told her that Maisie had carried the envelope every day for 3 weeks without opening it, had protected it like a responsibility she had been given and intended to honor. My mother went quiet for a moment. "She's remarkable," my mother said. "She's 9 years old," I said. "She learned it from someone." A pause. "Your father." "Yes," I said. And from watching the rest of us, including the parts she needed to correct for, my mother made a sound I had not heard before from her. It was short and complicated and contained more self-knowledge than most sounds I had received from her in 52 years. "We did not fix everything on that call. You do not fix 52 years on a Tuesday morning. But we said true things." And true things, said directly, are the material from which different versions of relationships are sometimes built. Derek, when I told him about the call, sat with it for a moment and then said, "So she's going to be better?" "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "She's going to try to be different. Whether that becomes better, I think that depends on whether the trying is real." He nodded. This is one of the things I love most about Derek. He does not rush to resolution. He lets things be at the stage they are actually at. "That sounds right," he said. I had a conversation with James Whitfield, the attorney, the week after the dinner. He had prepared the codicil with the care my father had requested, privately, properly, completely airtight. He told me that my father had been very clear about what he wanted and very deliberate about the process. He had come in knowing exactly what he intended to do, and he had done it without ambiguity. "He talked about you," James Whitfield said, "more than was legally necessary." "What did he say?" "He said you were the one who had always known what things were worth without needing to be told." I sat with that in the attorney's office for a long moment. Then I asked about the folder in the desk drawer that Frank had mentioned in the letter. Marcus drove to Columbus and retrieved it for me. It was a manila folder, thick, a rubber band round it. Inside, every business card I had given away for 18 years. Every design project I had mailed the family as a holiday card, printed screenshots of my business website, a copy of a local newspaper feature from 6 years ago about women-owned businesses in the county that had included 2 paragraphs about mine, with the relevant section circled in blue ink. He had been reading the circled paragraphs for 6 years. He had never said a word. That is the part I cried about, alone in my kitchen with the folder open on the table. Not the codicil, not the portfolio, not even the letter. The newspaper article with the blue circle. He had seen me. All along. He had been watching and keeping the evidence and saying nothing because he did not know how to say it in rooms where other people had already decided what the story was. That was the gift and the grief of it, contained in a blue ink circle in a manila folder. Late is better than never. He was right about that. He was right about most of the things that mattered. Maisie started 5th grade in September. She carries a different backpack now, a green one, because she decided purple was a color she had completed. This is very Maisie. She does not talk often about what she did at the dinner. She talks about it the way she talks about most things she's proud of. Without fanfare, as simple past tense. She gave Grandma the envelope. Great-grandpa asked her to, and she did. It was the right time. She has started asking me questions about design, not because anyone told her to, but because she's noticed in the year since the dinner that I spend a lot of my working hours on something she finds interesting and she wants to understand it. She sits at the kitchen table while I work sometimes. She asks good questions. She notices color before she notices most other things, which is a way of seeing the world that I recognize as my own and which I find in her with a recognition that is its own specific joy. Sophie is in Cleveland doing the work she went to law school to do. She calls twice a week, Sunday evenings and Thursday afternoons, when the case she is working on gives her 15 minutes of air. She does not need to call. She calls because she wants to, which is the version of a relationship I spent 28 years trying to build and which is now just the texture of our ordinary life. Derek and I walked in the park last Sunday and he said, the way he says things he has been thinking about for a while, "I think your dad knew Maisie would get the timing right." "I think so too," I said. "He trusted a 9-year-old. He trusted the right 9-year-old. Derek nodded. We walked for a while. "Do you feel different?" he asked. "After all of it?" I thought about this honestly. Because Derek asks questions honestly and deserves honest answers. "I feel like the ground has always been there," I said. "I just wasn't sure other people could see it." He put his arm around me. "I could always see it," he said. "I know. That is why I married him. Here's what I want to leave with you, because I have been sitting with this story for months and this is the truth I keep arriving at. The people who build their identity on being the standard against which others are measured almost always need you to stay smaller than you are. Not because they are evil. Most of them are not evil, but because your size confirms theirs. When you are defined as less, they are protected as more, and that protection is something they have needed for so long, they no longer know they need it. You cannot fix this for them. It is not yours to fix. What you can do is continue to be exactly what you are. Build the thing. Keep the record. Trust the people who see you, even the ones who see you quietly, from a distance in blue-circled newspaper articles they keep in manila folders in desk drawers, and teach your children what it looks like to be a person who keeps a promise. Because sometimes the most important thing you give someone is a sealed envelope and a purple backpack and the trust that they will know the right moment. Maisie knew. She always knew. That is not a coincidence. That is what happens when someone is raised in a house where keeping your word is treated as fundamental, where showing up is understood as the most important form of love, where no one ever looked at a child and said her value was something other than complete. That house was not perfect. No house is. But it had the right foundation, and a foundation held long enough, held consistently enough, held even when no one is watching and no one is saying, well done. A foundation becomes the thing everything else is built on. My daughter proved it on a May morning when she walked across a stage. My granddaughter proved it the night she reached into a purple backpack. And my father proved it, quietly, in a blue ink circle on a newspaper page for 6 years before any of us knew he was watching. If this story found you tonight, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments. Is there someone in your life who has been watching you and keeping the record, even quietly? Someone who saw you when the room was looking somewhere else? Tell me where you're watching from. Drop a city, drop a time, drop whatever you have. Share this with someone who has spent too long being measured against someone else's standard. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I would love to have you here for the next one.